Hi, everybody, and welcome to another edition of the Papers Podcast, where we make sense of the medical education literature to help you make sense of your day. I am here with the very usual cast of characters we've been recording for a while, so we're getting a little punchy. First, we'll say hi to my friend Jason.
Hi, Lara.
And John.
Dr. Varpio, so good to see you. I can just be polite and formal.
I know,
seriously. Keep all the animosity back down deep inside our souls.
See, Linda, you picked another great paper for us, so why don't you take it away?
I will, but I do take a little bit, I object a little bit to you calling us very usual. You said our very usual people.
But I thought about calling you the very unusual, and I thought that wasn't nice either. So,
all right. I have a paper which probably has no theory or conceptual framework. The methodology is iffy, but I thought the topic was fine, which is why we're doing it. It's something that affects all of us, and it maybe gives us something to think about.
I like the preemptive paragraph. I'm using that for John in the future. So there's nothing good about this paper, but it's worth talking about. I'm going to use that.
Right. So the paper is entitled, Where Do We Go From Here? An Inventory of Publicly Available Data About Educator Academies, Medical Education Departments, and Offices of Medical Education by Kearns, Dallahan, Borges, and Huggett in Academic Medicine. It is now May 2024, and this is released ahead of print. So this is a paper about medical education units of all kinds and what varied functions they have and how they've grown over the last few decades. And these authors look at the variety of units and try and align their name to a function. Now, I did entitle this What's in a Name, which is, of course, a Shakespearean reference. And if you're really good and you look back at our podcast, you will see that I've probably used at least 3 Shakespearean references over the last few years. And if you can find out what they are, I will buy you a coffee at the next MedEd conference. All right. The why of this paper, other than what I mentioned, is that there's been this growth of MedEd units of all kinds within the last probably 3 decades. An interest in their relationships and where they live within other structures within medical schools is come to the fore. So I would like you each, in a minute or so, because we're all linked with a MedEd unit of some sort, to describe your medical education unit by its name, its function, and where it fits, like who it reports to and who it's led by. Lara, Jason, John.
This is really interesting, Linda, because we are in the midst of developing our group, our center unit cluster.
So you're looking for a name?
Yeah, apparently.
Don't use cluster.
But so I can't tell you what our name is, but I can tell you that one of the things that's been really exciting about doing this developmental work is, so I'm working at the Children's Hospital of Philadelphia and the University of Pennsylvania, and it's at CHOP. I report to Dan West, and if you guys don't know Dan, he is just such an amazing leader and such a great medical educator in his own right. He did a lot of work. But he did a lot of work at UCSF. And before he came to CHOP. And I also work with Doreen Ballmer, who is a phenomenal scholar, like totally in her own right and just such a treasure to work with. But the way we've been doing this has been really great because we've been doing it based on the evidence that's in the literature, right? So we've been developing our group and our thinking about it in relation to what's published. And but more than that, we've also been doing it in what Doreen calls a principled driven way. So she worries about basic principles, foundation principles. And so we've been working very hard to come up with the foundational principles upon which our entire unit will rest. And so what we've decided those 3 things are, our focus is to build capacity for education-focused research that aligns with our institutions with CHOP's initiatives. And our purposes are to promote excellence, offer support, and to act with generosity. Under that frame, I can live here forever. Like, what a great focus.
Thank you.
That was a sentence?
Well, it was supposed to be a minute, but anyway.
Okay. You had like a paragraph before when I gave a sentence on the paper, so I'm taking it.
You should call it chop chop.
I thought that's a kind of sushi.
I got that joke.
Jason.
Hey, so listen, I'm at the University of Ottawa right now, and we actually have 2 units. It's kind of unusual. Well, maybe 3. We have a group under a vice dean that runs faculty development and CPD. We have a group under a vice dean that runs faculty development and CPD and another language in French. We have a department of med ed that's run by Vicky LeBlanc, and it is our vehicle to house the PhDs in medical education. And that is funded by main campus, reports through the dean. And then the one I'm in charge of is the Center for Innovation in Med Ed, and it's very teacher focused. It is all about service. We are there to support teacher careers. It's kind of an academy. We are there to promote education scholarship. We are there to help educator careers. We are there to produce products and services for the Faculty of Medicine. And we're there to build networks and communities. So it's very service oriented, focused on the faculty.
So at McMaster University, where I'm at, we have an Office of Continuing Professional Development led by a friend of the show, Dr. Ruth Chen, who is awesome. You should check all of her scholarship and her leadership out. I lead a research center called MERIT, so McMaster Education, Research, Innovation, and Theory. And so we're a research center that supports the Faculty of Health Sciences, School of Medicine, Nursing, and Rehab Sciences as well. We have kind of a dual mission. We have a core of scientists that produce education scholarship to advance our understanding of best practices. And then we also work in a community of practice model where we have clinical faculty that are members of our center. And so we have probably close to, I don't know the actual number right off the top of my head, but probably around 90 plus members of our center. And so we serve both as a function of producing scholarship, but also in that community of practice of supporting and collaborating and advancing the mission of growing that community of clinicians and scientists.
So similar at our place at McGill, we had a Center for Medical Education that became an institute, which is sort of the equivalent of a department, but it actually crosses normal boundaries. So it's called as it crosses normal boundaries. And its raison d'etre is education scholarship and innovation, but it also supports some of the things that Jason talked about, supports clinical faculty, particularly clinician educators. We also have a faculty development unit led by the Associate Dean, a CPD unit, same thing. And then there's all the people who do service in various other parts under the Vice Dean, everything from the Sim Center to the wonderful individuals who are helping undergrad and postgrad and nursing and physio, et cetera, do assessment, for instance. So what does this say? This says that medical education is pretty complex. Put up your hand if you'd like to be a dean of medicine these days. Nope, I don't see any hands going up. You know, there's the teaching and the learning across the continuum. There's research, there's support of the clinical environment for teaching and learning. There's teachers and learners themselves. There's fundraising, there's assessment, there's QI of education, call it accreditation. There's faculty development, there's education scholarship. There's a lot that goes into medical education these days. And lots of structures work, and it really does depend where you are, as we've heard. So particularly to do with supporting faculty, not necessarily faculty development in the traditional way, but supporting faculty and doing education scholarship. In the U.S., there's 3 entities that have arisen. I won't say emerged because Lava doesn't like that word. Academies of educators, departments of medical education, and centers of medical education. We've heard that there can be other words as well, and certainly around the world there are other terms that are used. But is there a link between what's best suited for function and context? You know, it's important to have some kind of med ed unit. It affects recruitment, retention, promotions, budget, accreditation compliance. Of course, it affects the quality of teaching and education scholarship. So why should clinician educators be interested in this? Well, particularly, I think if you're talking about personal development, career development, and education scholarship, I think this is important for CEs. And think about where you live as a CE. Are you in a place that actually aligns with what you want to do and where you want to go? So there's lots of previous work here. I'm not going to go into it. We have models, we have functions, we have it internationally, we have it in the US. The roles are growing, the roles are changing. And the thing that's really growing is education scholarship. Now, having said that, these authors hypothesize that departments of medical education would be the least prevalent structures identified in U.S. medical schools. And they're implying that departments of medical education are those units that tend to do more of the education scholarship. So their purpose was to inventory the current structures of med ed departments, offices, and academies in the U.S. and explore what we've just talked about, reporting structure, functions, and characteristics. So let me ask you, John, as a director of a unit, Jason, as a developer of a unit, and Lara, as you're getting into developing your unit, is this an important question?
It's a tricky piece to answer. Having comparators is helpful as a director to leverage in institutional support. One of the most powerful things that I've been able to do is say, school X and Y are doing it, and so this is why we should be thoughtful about understanding where the levers are. The common refrain for those deans of medicine that you're describing, Linda, is, yes, education is part of our core mission, but when you look at what are the levers in terms of resources, both human and fiscal resources, it's always, well, we have to deliver the clinical and we will do the research. Education is going to be done off the side of our desk with a budget that's scratched together from change we found underneath the cushions in our couch. So having an environmental scan that says, here's what the state of the art looks like, becomes a lever to say, okay, if we are lacking an organization, or if we are looking to advance and move up into an organization that requires more resources, it's helpful to say, well, this is what the state of the art currently looks like. So it's an operational question. I'm not sure in terms of a scholarly question or in terms of a question of general interest to a clinician educator. I think that's a bit harder of a stretch.
So I struggle with this question. I anticipated that this would be asked. I wasn't sure what the significance of this paper. I'm still a little bit working my way through it as we do this podcast. I think it has value, though. So I'm going to take that positive position that as somebody who's developing a center, I would like those comparables. I would like to hear a little bit more of what's under the hood of all of these. And then a much more powerful question, though, is what's the impact? What works? It's more of a realist kind of question. But this one is descriptive, and that still has value.
I have a lot of different thoughts, Linda, and I know that that's not a surprise at all, because I find this literature really interesting. I've been doing a lot of research in this space about units and academies and those sorts of things, and so I have I have a lot of interest in the topic. But my thing is that I'm not sure I'm necessarily interested in. So the work that I've done hasn't been comparing them, because a lot of these, group versus academy versus centered versus department, those are terms that often have a very local meaning. So an office in one university can imply that it receives funding as a subgroup within a department, wherein at another university, the name office can mean that it is a group or a center or an office that spans across all departments. And so this is a place where I think language, the word choice really matters, because words don't mean the same thing in different places. So I think that's something that needs to be taken into consideration, because what you're talking about then instead are what are the functions of these units? What are the purposes they aim to fulfill? And understanding them at that level is a very different thing than saying, well, these are all offices and they do this. And that just assumes a commonality around the word office that in my experiences across my research, that commonality doesn't hold. And the other part is that this is all done in American context, which is fine, right? We do things within the scope that we can, but it just means that we need to be remembering that these findings are going to be specific to the U.S. because the language, again, move internationally, whole different set of meanings associated with the language.
Yeah, absolutely, and certainly depending on the way you look at the way they did the inventory, I looked at their spreadsheet, went by the name. Hence what's in the name. But if you go by the function, it's quite different. So what did they do? They did an inventory, and I use that in quotation marks.
Hang on, could I just interrupt for a second? I get so much grief for my pronunciation, but you're saying inventory, which makes me think you're inventing the data rather than inventory.
It's an inventory.
Oh, an inventory.
It's definitely an inventory.
I say inventory
okay.
too.
If you want to say inventory, I'll say inventory.
But you can say inventory. I think that it makes you special.
I say tomato.
Sounds British.
I say tomato too.
The data
There you
sounds
go.
suspicious when it's in inventory.
All right. Okay. Inventory.
Inventory.
Whatever.
Inventory.
Whatever it is, they did it. What they started with, it was really a document review. They used one primary source, which was called a snapshot of medical student education in the U.S. and Canada, reports from 145 schools. It was from 2020. And they picked at those schools, then they searched the U.S. med school websites using appropriate keywords, which I won't go into, but which were appropriate. And then they did some in-depth, what they call browsing of the websites and a more extensive web search, really looking for name, reporting structure, and importantly, function. They used a spreadsheet, which is huge and has very small font, as far as I can tell. And they summarize various frequencies of the variable. There's no clear explanation of how the varying data were interpreted, but they seem to have said, oh, this unit does more research, or this unit is much more service-oriented, for instance. Now, we've talked about document reviews before. I'm not sure whether this is truly a document. It's a web review, I guess. I got interested in how we assure rigor in this methodology. And so I went looking. I spent much of the weekend and the afternoon looking to see if I could find anything. And there's not much out there, whatever you call it. If we say, what's the closest thing? Maybe it's a narrative review. We can actually try and look and see, did they have an appropriate scope, rationale, boundaries, reflexivity, to explain the interpretation and details on the analysis. I'd like to ask you all, how did these authors do? Jason, Lara, John?
I have to admit, I really struggled following their logic of rigor in this. It seems to me that they use that American survey of a fraction of the American schools, and then they use that as a launching pad to go look at the websites. I'm not sure that the survey added a lot of value to that process. Why not just go look at every website and have a priori some definitions and some criteria to gather your data? So I'm not sure I would call it a narrative review. I think it's kind of a document analysis if you use the web as a document. It's not an administrative database study because the original document, the original study that they pulled data from, they didn't really use directly. They sort of built off it. So I kind of lost their logic. I would have liked to have seen more about how they interpreted things, what their criteria were, why they sorted things one way or another, and where they were coming from for that. There's a nice intro with, a review of the literature, but I felt like that was sort of set aside and then they described what they saw. So I would have liked a little bit more of the logic.
So it's interesting, Linda, because this isn't a research paper. When I was reading it, the thing that I found myself tripping on was that the headings weren't research headings. So I was like, okay, so this isn't a research paper. And I did some poking around and found out it's a scholarly perspectives paper in academic medicine. And what triggered the headings then suggest like there's no introduction methods. Their headings are different. So the methods, I think, was called the process to create the inventory. So which you could say is a method section, but because it's not a research paper, I don't feel like I should hold it to the mandates of research. It's a perspective. And I also think that if we're looking for where we might house this in terms of our framing, you might think of this as an environmental scan, that there's an effort to try to figure out what's going on across this broader community. So that's fine. So I'm putting it under scholarly perspective in my mind. I don't think there are methods necessarily. Otherwise, it would have been a research paper. It's a perspective. They did things to develop a perspective, and I want to know about that. But I'm not sure I would try to give it a method score. Hint, hint, what's going to happen in the future.
I felt like it was a shoehorned paper into that category because it wasn't rigorous enough to get into the other category for that publication.
Well,
because they did a bunch of things to get data.
Yeah, they did do a bunch of things, but and it may have been shoehorned, but I actually think it's something that particular journal, Academic Medicine, would be interested in, because that's apparently something that the deans look at. And if that's the case, then, this is where you want to get this kind of work. John.
I kept going back to say, what kind of article is this? Where does it fall? I didn't figure it out as scholarly perspectives. Knowing that now, it still doesn't help me. I thought this was an environmental scan. And as an environmental scan, their chain of logic made me kind of like turn my head a couple times and say, okay, here we go. I'm going to hang on, because they don't actually do an environmental scan of the entire US database of medical schools. They truncate it. And then they said, well, we couldn't find some other stuff. And so they didn't even do that. And so I am unsatisfied even with the process of the environmental scan, because if you go to the supplementary data, they said, and hats off, by the way, to that single reviewer who did a hand search of 134 websites. God bless that soul. That's a lot of work. But then they don't actually do a categorical process or categorize based on a priori definitions of what an office, an academy, or department looks like, or reporting structures or descriptions or anything else. They just report what they see on the website. So if it says associate director, if it says office, that's what gets put there. And then they put a bunch of URLs so you too can go back and do a hand search to all the websites they found, but it's not formatted in any aggregated way to say, okay, in this environmental scan, we can now see these frequencies, these gaps, these whatnot. That work hasn't been done. And that's the last bit of work that makes an environmental scan happy. So you can see, here's what the environment kind of looks like. And then you can layer on interpretation. So I got to say, I do hope we do a vote, because...
All right. Well, let's move on then. So you're right, John. There were 134 out of 171 schools that had data. And the authors found that there were three kinds of units. And for the sake of the authors, they called them the Office of Medical Education. This was an office that supported the curriculum and student affairs, and may be linked with assessment or exams, and was usually led by a senior associate dean or a vice dean or somebody like that. Then there was a department or equivalent of medical education, which supported education scholarship. Often that's where the holders of PhDs were housed, led by a chair, as a department is. And then there was the Academy of Educators. And there was a lot of literature about academies about 10 years ago. This supported faculty development, not in the usual way, but by having an academic home or a community of learners for faculty, and was often led by a director or a board. Now, the frequency of the various types varied. Offices or the service type of medical education was the greatest, and departments of med ed, the least, was 4%. But in fact, there was a lot of crossover. There were some that had functions or names, as in Ottawa, where there was a department, an office, and an academy, or an academy and an office, for instance. And there's a nice little bubble diagram that shows you that. And interestingly, 6% of the schools they looked at had none. And I suspect it might be more than 6% because of those other 30-odd schools where they didn't find data, maybe because they had none. So the authors conclude that the least prevalent structure identified was departments of med ed. This is significant because it underscores the difficulty medical education leaders have in obtaining information to research, compare, select, and design the model that's best suited to support faculty educators and, in fact, to support education at their institutions. So that's what the authors say about this. I agree with you, Lara. This is limited to U.S. units and also to primarily undergrad. Doesn't really talk very much about postgrad, or GME, as it is called in the States, because that's under a different umbrella in the States compared to many countries. And, there's other places that have units or entities of medical education. Many of the colleges or standard-setting organizations do. So this is, I think, a lot more varied than these authors would say. One little thing I want to mention, in the paper, at the very beginning under authors, they have a section called previous presentations, and they list where this data has been presented. This is something that's not yet common in our publications, and I'm wondering if we should be doing this. So I'll stop here for some comments about the results, and then we'll go on to our highly relevant voting. John, Jason, Lara.
The authors try to make the results of the so what, which is now you have a sense of the status and you can use it to leverage what you need at your own institution. I'm not sure if that's fully the case because I don't actually see the granular detail or the aggregated composite for me to use that kind of comparator piece. I think what we see there is having a medical education unit of some nature is probably an accreditation standard because of the schools they could find, 95 or actually 94% actually had a reporting structure. There's 8 schools that didn't have any reporting data. And so when I look at this, I like to say, with my hat as the director of our own research center, it's like, okay, we're probably not perfectly describing what a research center is because we perform research, but we also act as an academy as per this definition. And we would have got pulled into the academy, but we'd have lost our education scholarship type from this analysis. It doesn't matter because this is only unique to the US. And so you even have to ask yourself, is this leverage for your context anyway? Because my dean will say, that's great, that's the States. But American schools need to have this other piece. And so I guess I'm struggling with what to do with the results here. It's not going to be particularly impactful for me and my center, except to say we can probably do more than simply saying we have a unit. We might want to make the argument as a clinician educator community that all of these things, supporting faculty development, supporting the service and the delivery of our educational programs, and then supporting scholarship, all of those are 3 tiers that are really necessary to advance the educational mission of our organizations. And perhaps we need all those 3 distinct tiers happening. And maybe the meta-analysis of theirs is to look at their figure 1 and say, there's not a Venn diagram where we see all 3 of those things happening in a really successful way, with the exception of 9 programs that have all those 3 functions happening. And so, in fact, the necessary resources for education is only happening in about 7% of the studied schools in the US. And so maybe it's a call to arms to say we should really double down on the education. But that's a big, massive leap of logic that I've taken by looking at their data, repurposing it, and trying to make that argument from A to B. And it's my own interpretation. I'm not sure if the authors would be friendly to that take.
I'm not sure what to do with this paper. I really love the topic because I'm trying to build a center. And I want to know what's out there and what people are doing and what works. This paper gives me some snapshots, some names, some titles, some labels. Maybe that's what you're getting at, Linda, but I'm just not sure what to do with it. I'd really like to. I do have one obscure compliment, though. My obscure compliment is I was really impressed by how global and savvy the lit search was. If you look through the references, there's a lot of references to other papers from around the world that aren't readily available to all of us. So good on them for finding them. I'm just not sure what to do with this paper.
What you do with this paper is you go back to their supplemental data and click on the websites. That's the problem with this paper. John, one thing you said, you talked about tiers, faculty development, education scholarship, service, etc. I wouldn't like us to think about these as tiers or hierarchical levels. They're all essential.
If I said tiers, that was a misspeak in real time, not an intentional framing.
He was thinking about crying. He's thinking about all the difficulties he's had launching those.
So I'm not going to be able to add much to the conversation, except the one thing I want to highlight is that the academies that the authors describe in this paper, and I've done some research in this field for, it's been quite a few years now. But so from what I can tell you, in my experience, they're uniquely American. And academies exist in the US because there's this interesting kind of bait and switch thing that happens when clinician educators get hired. at various institutions. They can be hired to be teachers, but then some of the challenges happened around promotion and tenure that they couldn't get promoted for being teachers. So they needed to have these groups, clusters, institutions developed locally in order to help these individuals meet the promotion criteria and also to lobby for promotion criteria locally. So academies do really important things in the US, but it's a bit of an American phenomenon. So when you then take these findings and say, what can we do with them? Well, it's in the US, you probably can do some things with them, but when you go outside of the US, it's a little harder. Jason, one point that I just wanted to highlight is that you said that this would be ripe for a realist review. And Rola Ajawi and team did a realist review of exactly this literature and all of the pieces of it. So if you're looking for a realist review, that's one that I'd suggest you would be pretty handy.
That will be very helpful to Jason. So one final thought I have, I'm wondering if there's an evolution of these types. I'm not going to give them names, but you start off as a service type thing, and then you go into the academy, call it the faculty support type thing, and then you go into an education scholarship sort of field. And maybe some places go directly to education scholarship, but I would bet that most schools, if not all schools, have some sort of service component that's in what they're calling an office, and then they move, quote unquote, up from there.
So it's interesting that you should say that, Linda, because there's research in the domain that talks about the logics that hold these different units together. And one of the logics that every unit needs to navigate is where it sits on the research, service, and teaching focus. Are they going to be research focused, service focused, teaching focused? And every institution, based on other local logics, like who's paying and how important return on investment is, and also if it's UME, GME, CME, or across all of them, it's like there's these 3 or 4 different logics that, depending on how each of those is in focus, that's going to shape what kind of unit or academy or department or office or whatever it is that you're going to have, because it is all about the local context and what the values are locally that enable you to build different kinds of things. It's really cool data out there. It's like really great. I think this is just a fascinating body of literature.
So based on that, let's move on to our highly rigorous, stop rolling your eyes. I'm not sure, John, you really want to do a methods one? Lara's shaking her head, John. I don't think we should, myself. Jason?
It's hard to know what standard to hold this to. Like I say, I got the impression that they started out in one direction and shoehorned into another category. But I would skip the methods.
Yeah, I mean,
it's a perspectives paper.
The only thing I would be concerned about was how they interpreted the data. But let's look at education impact here. And I'll go Jason, John, Lara.
Oh, I really like these authors.
Do you get an extra point for that?
Paper.
If you like the authors?
They get an extra point for that. Yes. Because I have to talk to them someday face to face. I'm just not sure what to do with this paper. And I really, really like this topic. So I'm going to give it a 2.
I'm going to give it a 2. I think it makes an important meta inference, which is I'm going to try to say we need more support for education, even though it looks like every institution studied has an office or a unit of some nature. It's insufficient, that single structure, that there is probably a multi-tiered approach to supportive education. And so this paper can say, hey, in fact, when you look at the analysis and where the Venn diagram starts to work, there is insufficient support for education. So I think that makes it. But I don't think the way that all the data is aggregated so that you can see their version of environmental scan, they haven't done the hard work for us, which is being explicit about we've categorized them in this way. We have found other descriptors of this so we can actually see what's existing. It's at too superficial a level for me to say, hey, it really brings that value add. And so that's why I kind of follow there.
Well said, John.
So you know what I want to do? I'm going to do what I always do and not answer your question. But I want to put the little pin, the pinwheel that shows you your computer is thinking? It's that little, like my husband calls it the pinwheel of death, because it means that you're
the rainbow of death.
The rainbow of death that goes around and around. That's what I want to give this paper, because I think this paper is part 1. I feel like this is the first hunk of a manuscript about because it promises more. So I think there's a part 2 coming. If I were to look at the crystal balls of life, I would say there's a part 2 coming, and that's the paper I want to give an impact rating for, because I think it's pending. I think it's coming.
Yeah, that is. So it's for future reference. So I'm going to give this a 3. I am concerned about the interpretation of things, but I think it does provide some useful data. And like all of you, I would love to see the data reorganized probably by function to begin with, and then maybe by place in the institution, but primarily by function. I don't really care what's in a name, to go back to the title. I really care about what's happening. Does every medical school have to have a medical education research unit? No. But every school has to have probably the other 2 parts of that triangle that Lara mentioned, the service and the teaching, which would be the faculty here. So that's it. A paper with methods that we didn't rate, and we were a little iffy about what it means, but we have great hopes for the future. So again, we're glad that you listened. And if you want to reach us for any reason, including to tell Jason that his hair is kind of, you can reach us at thepaperspodcast@gmail.com, or you can find us at Papers
Take care, everybody.
Podcast. And with that, I will say bye-bye.
Talk to you later.
It took us a long time, but we finally did the outro on the first take. Thanks for listening.
You've been listening to the Papers Podcast. We hope we made you just slightly smarter. The podcast is a production of the Unit for Teaching and Learning at the Karolinska Institutet. The executive producer today was my friend Teresa Sörö. The technical producer today was Samuel Lundberg. You can learn more about the Papers Podcast and contact us at www.thepaperspodcast.com. Thank you for listening, everybody, and thank you for all you do. Take care.